The government's announced a review of hundreds of infrastructure projects ahead of the budget next week. Let's bring in the Shadow Infrastructure Minister Bridget McKenzie, joining me live from Melbourne. Thanks for your time. The government argues via the Minister, Catherine King, that the former coalition government had hundreds of projects added to this pipeline of infrastructure, but without the dollars to build them. Why shouldn't they have a review?
Well, Kieran, the infrastructure pipeline of $120 billion over a decade time was a suite of projects that were agreed with local councils, with state governments and communities that were actually designed to grow the economy and ensure that that filtered right throughout our country from suburbs, capital cities and the regions. It was also a pipeline to smooth out what had previously been quite a boom-bust cycle for construction, that we could get the planning, design and construction phases of sometimes quite large projects in sync for business certainty. And what the Minister has announced today has thrown all that to the wind. You've got construction companies waking up today who had planned a pipeline of work for their workforce, who'd geared up and purchased equipment and the like, now wondering whether they are going to be going into receivership, whether they're going to have to sack workers as a result of knowing whether one of the hundreds of projects in the pipeline is going to be cut or delayed by Labor because they cannot get the structural issues in the budget under control.
The government said it's going to be a very short review, so a tight turnaround. Does that ease any of those concerns that you hold there? And isn't it better that they ensure that all of the projects are fit for purpose, going to be productive, as opposed to just simply splashing the cash?
Well, Kieran, I haven't drunk Catherine King's Kool-Aid on this, that much needed, deserved and critical projects for suburbs, to bus congestion, for capital cities, road and rail projects, bridges right across the country are somehow splashing the cash. They are critical projects that communities have sought, that they've voted for in the past and that are now in the pipeline of planning, design and construction. This is simply the Labor Party finding a quick fix a week out from their budget to pay for their reckless spending because they haven't been able to make the tough decisions in ERC to get those structural challenges that the budget faces under control. And I think it is an appalling approach by a Commonwealth government. It, as I said, is put a critical amount of uncertainty into the construction pipeline. And right now, communities rightfully need to be asking, is it their local road, their bridge, their bypass, their section of the inland rail? I mean, we've got hundreds of projects across the country that were there for good reasons that are now facing the chop.
Is it true, though, that some of the projects, Catherine King says 160 projects had less than $5 million allocated to them, so hadn't begun or had barely anything committed to them? Well,
Kieran, if we used Catherine King's methodology there, we wouldn't have put $2.2 billion in her October budget to the suburban rail loop here in Melbourne, a project that's going to cost in excess of $250 billion. So it's less than 1% of this project's total cost here and now. It also doesn't have a cost-benefit analysis. It hasn't been through Infrastructure Australia, and it has a damning Victoria Auditor General's report. When you talk about the funding that was set aside, sometimes quite, in the hundreds of thousands to up to $5 million, you're talking about smaller congestion busting projects in suburbs. You're also talking about some of that planning work and design work that is essential to make sure we get the right project constructed in the right place to achieve the right outcomes. And that requires quite detailed work that is often quite expensive. And hence, those under $5 million, if they're chopped, that means certain projects that people voted for, that communities have been expecting, won't arrive at Infrastructure Australia because they won't have the cost-benefit analysis and that quite detailed technical work done, which is what a lot of that those projects or that phase of project funding was put aside for.
Shadow Infrastructure Minister Bridget McKenzie joining me live from Melbourne. Appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
See you, Kieran.